Hello, everyone. So here we are. It is Monday of what it turns out is the last week of classes, which is a little weird. Speaking of a little weird, I'm not sure just how social distancing is messing with everybody else's head, but I'm getting some pretty weird dreams, cryptic but weird. And since we've already been through the Freud, so last night, nightmare. I'm in a class. There's only maybe 10 people in the class. It's an hour and a half class. It's only been about an hour, and I'm used to people being like, "Hey, Neos, can we just go now? Can we take the rest of the time? You should let us go early." And I was like, "No, no, we got other stuff to cover." And then I looked up, and like all but two of the people had gone. I had no power whatsoever to make anybody stay at any particular time in the classroom. It was just like very shaking, and then I couldn't find all my papers. And then I left the classroom finally to go back to my office, but it was a strange building and I couldn't find the right hallway. And then on my way back, I realized that maybe one of the reasons why people were wanting to go early was because like I had forgotten there was a test that day and was trying to just give a regular lecture. And when I finally get back to my office after going down the wrong hallway 3 or 4 different times, the the door had actually been moved. They'd rearranged it, knocked out a wall, and all my stuff was somewhere else. My office was somewhere else. It was just like nothing is normal. Everything is weird. So I hope you're doing as well or better than I am. In order to help deal with that, water, just water. But you'll notice on the bottom, I got a cool thing this weekend. If you can read that, that is Kennedy Woodworks. That is actually from the wood shop of Chris Kennedy, the in the math department, who made little tumblers for all of us in the D&D group. So cheers to you wherever you are. Cheers to parents if you're listening. Let's go do this. This lecture is the second one on social psych chapter, and it actually has some of the stuff that is most near and dear to my heart in terms of interesting, fun things that I can share with you that are not yet part of the mainstream literature in such a way that it might have penetrated through to an introductory psych book. So let's go ahead and get started. I won't say, by the way, let's get straight into this, because that's what every YouTuber says after they've rambled on for like 5 minutes. Let's get straight into this. No, your chance to get straight into this was done 4 minutes and 30 seconds ago. So let's proceed with our lecture. What we're talking about this time is persuasion, prejudice, groups, just all sorts of different stuff. And one of the things having to do with persuasion, following up on the end of the last talk on Friday, was this idea, very popular term to throw around, but very misunderstood by most people who use the term, is this idea called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is a social psych phenomena whereby there is proposed to be some discomfort between how you hold an attitude and what behavior you put out there into the social world. And the best classic example of how to demonstrate that somebody is experiencing cognitive dissonance was from this study by Festinger and Carlsmith, in which they got people to sign up for psychological studies, and they were then given the task of, under some rationale, doing something like what you see here. You see all these knobs? Their task was to turn each one of those knobs a quarter turn to the right until they were all done, and then do it again, and then do it again, and then do it again for like 20, 25, 30 minutes. That was the task, was to just turn those things for 30 minutes. It was designed to be a soul crushingly awful, boring, repetitive task that nobody had any chance of actually liking. But that was just the setup. The experiment came in where subjects were then randomly assigned by the experimenters into 3 groups The first group of people at the end of that soul crushing task was told, hey, we're having a really hard time getting people to sign up for this study, probably because it's so boring. But we need your help. We need your help. And if we could, we would really love to have you just on your way out. If you see somebody else waiting to come in for the study, could you just do your best to talk up the task and tell them that it was fun and tell them that you enjoyed it and that they should be like, I don't know, just ready to do it, to be enthusiastic about doing it, because we're having a real hard time with people like just not doing it and quitting. And here I've got $1 on me that I can give you. Now this is 1959, so $1 then was worth about $8 right now. And then you sent people out there. And the second group of people randomly assigned, they said the exact same request, but in compensation for going out and telling the person in the foyer that the thing was fun, they said, here, I've got a 20. And a 20 in 1959 was about $160. So quite a bit of money for a student. I'd be sure if I handed you $160, you'd be willing to consider any number of requests. And in the third control, the third group of control, people were not asked to go out into the foyer and lie at all about how enjoyable the task was. Now, those are the independent variables. Those are the 3 level of the independent variable, the thing that was manipulated by the experimenter. The thing that was measured after the fact, after people either went out and lied for $1 or went out and lied for $20 or weren't asked to lie at all, they were then asked, oh, by the way, how enjoyable do you think the task really was? And the God's honest truth, of course, is that the task was awful. It was supposed to be awful. It was designed to be awful. But the results were illuminating. In condition A, where they got a little bit of money, but nevertheless went out into the foyer and told a bald-faced lie to another person, there were 2 things going on in that person's head. The first thing was that I just got paid a little bit to tell a lie. And that was not really sufficient for me as the kind of person that I think I am, a good person, to actually go about lying. I don't think of myself as the kind of person who lies for a buck. But the second cognition that is rattling around in their head is the fact that they know that they went out and really did lie. So they have one thought, I'm not a person who lies for $1, and another thought, which is, I just lied. And so the idea is that those 2 thoughts are now in dissonance with each other. Cognitively, they cannot be in the same brain at the same time, being fully considered and fully endorsed, because they are in contradiction with each other. That creates what the authors called high dissonance, which would require a big change. Now, here's the thing. Can you change your memory of your action? Not without a real break with reality. We're not talking about something like that. But the thing that you can change in order to bring these 2 cognitions in line was whether or not what you had just done was in fact a lie. And it's not really that much of a lie if the task wasn't so bad. So in order to close the gap between your opinion of yourself as willing to tell a lie for $1 and your opinion of yourself as somebody who actually told that lie, you eliminate the idea that that was the lie. And you say, you know what, that was actually not so bad a task. It was actually kind of fun. And so you tell the person it was really actually kind of fun. All right. And so people who were under that condition actually rated the task more fun than either of the other 2 conditions. Here's the next condition, in condition B. First cognition, I just got $158, which means I lied, but it was a lot of money. So I can kind of say, you know what, I am still a good person if I would take that trade-off. Yeah, it was a little white lie. They signed up for the study anyway, blah, 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 blah. But I got $158 in my pocket, and I told somebody the task that wasn't fun was fun. I'm good with that. I can be that kind of person. I'm happy to be that kind of person tomorrow. If I was given that choice again, I'd take the money again. That is what they said was a low resonance condition, low dissonance condition. And it didn't require very much of a change at all. If you want to make yourself feel a little bit better about it, you could talk to yourself and justify it. And so you might make the task a little bit more fun to yourself, but it doesn't require that big of a change because you're pretty much okay with the action as it was. You lied, but you lied for a lot of money. Anybody would have done it, right? Okay. And in the control task, nobody is asking you to lie. You are free to be honest about how much the task sucked, and you say that task sucked, right? So they had the lowest rating of the funness of the task because they were just being truthful. This cognitive dissonance explanation was necessary, by the way, because this study took place in the atmosphere where behaviorism was king, behaviorism was reigning. And remember, if you think about behaviorism and how simple it is, things for which you are reinforced become the kind of thing that is rewarding, the kind of thing that you want to do. So a behaviorist would have been forced to predict that if you give somebody 20 bucks after they've done a task, they will enjoy that task more because they've been rewarded. They've been given a reward after performing an action. That makes the action more desirable. That's what behaviorism is. Doesn't even matter what the 20 bucks is for. You got 20 bucks after you did a task, you're like, that was great. So very much at odds with the behaviorists, the people who were proponents of cognitive dissonance had said, these are the results. How do we explain it? Cognitive dissonance. We are motivated to keep our thoughts in line with each other. And if you can't change your memory of a behavior, then you can change your opinion or your attitude on a thought. So attitudes were the things that tended to change under the stress of cognitive dissonance. Now, 1959 was a long time ago, and there have been a lot of studies and a lot of thinking and a lot of theorizing since then. And this idea that what is going on is cognitive dissonance is no longer universally accepted. All right. Cognitive dissonance, then, to recap, was the idea that you have conflicting cognitions that is creating discomfort through dissonance. And so you have to change the cognitions in order to keep them in line with each other. All right. And the two things that are going on here are awareness of your behavior, that's one cognition, and your attitude, which is another cognition. And those are coming into conflict. One modern example of this is if you have a very bad attitude towards people who are texting and driving, and you go, that sucks, that person's putting everybody in danger, but then you find yourself doing it, you will probably, if you can't change your behavior, you will probably change your attitude towards the behavior and start to think about texting while driving as something that is not as dangerous as everybody says. Okay, you haven't changed your behavior, you've changed your attitude. Self-perception theory, on the other hand, has a different take on what it is that we are doing when we change our attitude when it comes into conflict with our memory of a behavior. Self-perception theory basically says we have a part of our brain that reflects upon our behavior and our actions in the past as if we were another person from the outside looking at ourselves. And so we attribute the behavior that we've engaged in the past to the attitudes that we must have had, otherwise we wouldn't have engaged in that behavior. So we are, in a sense, spinning our attitudes in real time as a reflection on our past behavior. And so if we remember ourselves lying about having enjoyed something, then we think, wow, I must have actually enjoyed it, otherwise I wouldn't have lied. Okay, so if you lied for $1, you think, well, I must really have enjoyed it if I would have lied for $1. But if you lied for $20, you say, well, I might not have enjoyed it that much, but I still lied because it was 20 bucks. That doesn't involve any conflict. That doesn't involve any dissonance. It's just a straightforward logical reading of why would I have done that? Well, I would have done that because my attitude was in line with my behavior. Well, then what was my attitude? Well, my behavior was this, so my attitude must have been that. The idea that self-perception theory is actually perhaps a better explanation is in line with studies where they took people's measures of arousal and discomfort while they were in a situation that should have been creating cognitive dissonance. And they found plenty of situations where the arousal and the discomfort doesn't go up. People aren't uncomfortable while they are in a position to change their behaviors. It doesn't necessarily involve discomfort at all, which is a real thorn in the side of cognitive dissonance theory, because dissonance doesn't seem to be necessary in order to achieve the behavior, in order to achieve the attitude change based on past behavior. Now, this whole time, the cognitive dissonance literature has been talking about this thing called the idea that you are not having sufficient justification, okay, insufficient justification. A dollar is insufficient justification for you to lie, therefore it must not have been a lie. There is, and I've mentioned this before, an opposite phenomenon called over justification, whereby if you get too much reward, then you start to assume that your attitude towards the thing is actually negative. Whereas if you weren't rewarded at all, you would have thought this is pretty fun. But once somebody starts rewarding you for it, you think this sucks. I'm only doing it for the reward. So if you add a reward to an already preferred activity, it makes the intrinsic motivation to do that kind of drop off a little bit. This is the story of my interest in evolutionary psych, by the way. It was a hobby at first. I read these books for my own edification, for my own enjoyment, because I found them interesting. I walked around the bookstore. I saw, oh, The Selfish Gene. That looks interesting. I've heard of that. Let's read that. Another book, kind of along those lines. I don't remember what was in it. It wasn't a very good book. It wasn't very scientific, but I read it for fun anyway, called Mean Genes. Then I read The Lucifer Principle. Terrible book. Howard Bloom was an awful scientist, but I was learning why. I was reading the book and I'm going, I know why this guy is full of crap. This is hilarious. This is awesome. I'm getting to know things. I actually ordered an evolutionary psych textbook written by David Buss at the University of Texas at Austin for Christmas so that I could keep reading up on my hobby. And I'm like, man, this is really getting interesting. I wonder where I might go to grad school. If I decide to go to grad school, I think I want to go to grad school. Do I want to go to grad school? And so I got into grad school at Santa Barbara, where John Tooby and Lita Cosmides were teaching. They were the authors of this book, which became basically the last book I read for pleasure. It was the last time that I really, truly, thoroughly enjoyed, on its own terms, reading stuff about evolutionary psych, because after that, it was a sign. It was something that I was going to be rewarded for reading with good test grades or good recommendations or advancement in my program or advancement in my career. And after that, ever since, it's been a little bit of a slog to read the kind of thing that I loved reading on my own before. So, do you enjoy reading? You might. There might be things that you read for hours and hours and hours. You can't stop because you just love to read it. But the minute I assign it to be read for a grade, it's a slog. You hate it. That's why. Over justification. All right. Another thing that goes along with insufficient justification, by the way, is an attitude towards rules. Insufficient justification is something that changes your attitude depending on how much you've been rewarded or how much you've been punished. And one explanation for why an authoritarian style parent who is very strict on the rules but doesn't give any explanation sometimes runs into children who are very poorly behaved outside of the context of that strict parent has to do with insufficient justification and attitude change. An authoritarian style parent will tend to have strict, reliable, heavy punishments for behavior. Those punishments then are, for the child, sufficient justification for why they might engage in good behavior around that parent. I am acting well so that I don't get punished, not I'm acting well because acting good is a good thing to do. It's because it's all about the punishment. The punishment is so salient. And so what these children end up doing is this thing called, in behaviorist terms, stimulus discrimination. Stimulus discrimination is where you identify something in your environment that will tell you whether or not you're going to be rewarded or punished for a certain behavior. So some behavior is rewarded in some contexts, but punished in other contexts. That's stimulus discrimination. So you know that if you're hanging out with your friends and you're being cool and you're trying to act like you know everything and you know the lingo, and you're in like 10 years old and you use cuss words around 10 other 10-year-olds, you're great, you're golden. But if there's an adult present, stimulus discrimination would say that behavior is not going to be reinforced, that behavior is going to be punished. And so you learn to adjust your behavior pretty automatically based on what the likely outcome is. So an authoritarian style parent will have a kid who doesn't have an internalized sense of whether it is intrinsically worthwhile to act in a way that's pro-social or good. They do it to avoid punishment, and they avoid punishment when their parents are around. The authoritative style parent, however, the one who has strict boundaries but explains the rules and justifies them and listens and works with kids, will present an insufficient justification for following rules, but the kid finds themselves following rules anyway. Therefore, in reflecting on their own behavior, a kid must say, wow, I must really value this rule if I follow it. I'm not afraid of punishment. I'm not afraid of my parent. And that justification is likely to follow them outside of context where their parent is there, because it is a part of their attitude that extends to the wider world. One theoretical explanation why, at least in the short term, temporarily, you might see different rates of misbehavior from authoritarian and authoritative parenting styles. The nice thing about cognitive dissonance, by the way, is that it gets you over time happier and happier with the choices that you have made in your past. You had a fairly big choice to make in your life relatively recently when you were deciding which university to attend. I had the same choice when I was a little bit younger than you. I had a full ride scholarship to a couple of schools in my home state of Missouri. I had put out a couple of other applications to other places, and I also applied to Purdue University in Indiana. It's a public school, but it's out of state. That means out of state tuition. That means that I wasn't going to be getting a car. I know, first world problems, but I wasn't going to be getting a car because I was actually going to be spending tuition dollars my parents were going to pay up for me. But I chose it. I went there. I had a fabulous time. And as time has gone by, I can't imagine having done anything else. I'm really, really happy with my decision. Then I went to Denver. I got a master's degree in counseling that, as I've said before, I no longer use. Was it a waste? Nah, a lot of great things happened to me in Denver. Yeah, I got a degree that I didn't use. Yeah, it cost many tens of thousands of dollars more. Yeah, I didn't get started on my actual graduate school for 4 or 5 years after I graduated from undergrad. Fine, but you know what? I made that decision. Good things happened. It looks better and better and better in hindsight, okay? When I went to graduate school, I could have gone to here, the University of New Mexico. Steve Gangestad and Jeffrey Miller were very open to the idea of my coming and studying evolutionary psych there. It was tempting. The real estate was cheap. The program looked good. A lot of it looked really interesting. But Santa Barbara was another option. It was a little bit more expensive. I don't know, in terms of living there, but I'm not sure what I should do. We picked Santa Barbara. I picked Santa Barbara. I can't imagine how life would have been if I hadn't. I'm so happy with that choice. And that's what it is. Right now, Santa Barbara, it was like one of the best things that ever happened to me. So this idea that your attitudes must have been in line with your behavior and what you wanted comes in handy when you look back in your past and you want to be happy about your life. Great. You think you must have done things that made you happy because, well, you did it. Nice thing for me is that I also chose CNU. I had options. Maybe one other option. If anybody's ever heard of Pennsylvania, there's a place there called Slippery Rock. Slippery Rock and I were in talks to take a job there, but I also got a call from the provost at CNU and said I could have a job here. And I called up Slippery Rock and I said, thank you so much. I'm just going to call off the negotiations and come here to CNU. It's a decision that I made. The more time goes on, the more I think, yeah, good call.
I was driving down the street past the gas station. There were 2 signs in the window: help wanted, self-service. So I went in and hired myself. So I get out of the bed. I figured I'd go for a walk. She said, how long are you going to be gone? I said, the whole time. When I was out in the middle of the desert, a UFO landed. 3 1-inch tall guys get out. They walked over to me. I said, are you really 1 inch tall? They said, no, we're really very far away. I remember the day the candle shop burned down. Everybody just stood around and sang happy birthday. So I get off the plane and I forgot to undo my seatbelt and I'm pulling the plane through the terminal. And the wings are knocking people over. And then I almost broke both my arms trying to hold open a revolving door for a woman. And I headed for the highway and began hitching. Within 3 minutes, I got picked up by one of those huge trailer trucks carrying 20 brand new cars. I climbed up the side of the cab and they opened the door and the guy said, I didn't have much room in here. I want to get in one of the cars and back. So I did. He's really into picking up people because he picked up 19 more. We all had our own cars. Then he went 90 miles an hour, we all got speeding tickets. I was cesarean born. Can't really tell. Although, whenever I leave a house, I go out through the window. I had a dream. I had a dream that all the babies prevented by the pill showed up. They were mad. I remember when I was 7, my grandmother said, "Stephen, come over here." And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "You know, you're over there. Now come over here." I said, "All right." And then she said, "Here's $10, and don't tell your mother that I'm giving this to you." And I said, "It'll cost you more than that." I got a new dog. He's a paranoid retriever. He brings back everything because he's not sure what I threw him. One time, right in the middle of a job interview, I took out a book and I started reading. The guy said, "What the hell are you doing?" I said, "Let me ask you one question. If you were in a vehicle and you were traveling at the speed of light, and then you turned your lights on, would they do anything?" He said, "I don't know." I said, "Forget it then, I don't want to work for you." My theory of evolution is that Darwin was adopted. I was 5 years old watching TV. Only you can prevent forest fires. Oh no. Every night out the window with a bucket of water. The ice cream truck in my neighborhood plays Helter Skelter. One time I went to the drive-in in a cab. The movie cost me $95. I've been arrested several times. I can't wait to be arrested and go all the way to the witness stand. Do you swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Yes, you are ugly. Woman in the jury, I'd really like to sleep with her. Should I keep going, or are you going to ask me questions?
All right. Now we're into a topic that I really want to give some extra attention to. The ugly side of social psychology is stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination, group on group mistrust, violence, all these things. These are studied by social psychologists as a function of how human brains happen to be set up. So let's get a couple of bits of terminology out of the way, and then I'm going to throw something at you that's nowhere in the book, but I'm really interested in making sure that you know. First off, stereotype. Probably the least harmful in the hierarchy of things that you can do to think unfairly about a group of people. A stereotype is nothing more than a schema, a set of assumptions or expectations containing impressions about a group of people and the members within that group. Stereotypes are not really defensible, but in a way they are defensible. Most of the time, when we talk about stereotypes, we talk about things that are causing prejudice and causing discrimination. Those are coming up here in the talk. But a stereotype itself is just a way of trying to bundle or consolidate knowledge about people so that when you meet a new person, you don't have to start from scratch and learn everything fresh and new about that person. So if you see someone who has a Canadian flag on their backpack, you might be able to talk to them about something Canadian. You might be able to ask them about how they feel about the discontinuation of the penny, something Canadians have done and we haven't managed to. And that might be something that you assume you can have a conversation about. That is a stereotype. It was an assumption about a person because you think you know something about their group membership, but it keeps you from having to ask every little thing about a person. Okay. So there's a lot of things that you can assume about a person that actually turn out to be true. Okay. So, but we get into problems when it becomes prejudice and becomes discrimination. Prejudice, which is another word for prejudgment, judging before you have the facts, judging before you know, is an unjustified and sometimes positive, but usually negative assumption about the members of a group. Some prejudgments that people point out, oh, that's a positive prejudice, are like, Asian people are good at math, or African Americans are better at dancing. You say, oh, what's wrong with that? It's still gross. It lumps people together in a group in a way that isn't valid. But again, usually it's negative, and it predisposes people towards this thing called discrimination, which your book calls social discrimination. All right, so stereotype is this kind of an assumption about a group. Prejudice is that you're judging somebody by the statistics or by the stereotype of their group membership. So you think you know something about them, which you probably don't actually know. And then comes discrimination or social discrimination. Discrimination is where it actually gets ugly because you've now engaged in a behavior, something external, something you've put out into the world through action or speaking, that is an unfair treatment of a person that was based on a prejudice or based on a stereotype. Okay. If you don't hire a woman for a leadership position because your prejudice against that person, your prejudgment is that they won't be assertive because your stereotype of women is that they are not assertive, that was an act of discrimination, something that becomes behavioral external to you. If a person walked around their entire life with a head screaming full of stereotypes and prejudice, but somehow miraculously managed to treat everyone with respect and as individuals and equally, I would like to argue that that would not be a problem for me. That would not be a problem in our society. However, that's an extremely unrealistic, impossible state of affairs. Your prejudgments, your stereotypes affect your behavior. Now, the thing is, discrimination is something that sometimes people justify by talking about the averages of the groups that they are discussing. That is where we get into trouble. Let's say that I wanted to hire somebody who was reasonably tall to work in a warehouse in order to stock the shelves. And I took a look at this graph that says, okay, here is the average height for women. Here is the average height for men. Clearly, the average man, if he was right here, is taller than the average woman. So for this job, I'm going to hire a man. I'm not going to even think about interviewing or hiring women. That is an act of discrimination. And the reason that that is an act of discrimination that I would say is inappropriate is because look at all these women here who are taller than all these men over here. Almost every single measurement that you can take between any two groups that you can imagine is going to, with a large enough sample, demonstrate a difference between the average person of one group and the average person of another group. That's just the case. Okay? Blonde people are going to be differently good at hockey than brunette people. People with long fingernails are going to have a different reading speed from people with short fingernails. I don't know which direction it would go, but if you tested enough people, you get an average difference. That does not inform or justify decisions made at the individual level, which is why we're so down on discriminatory behavior. Because the best way to figure out if somebody is tall enough to work in this warehouse and stock the shelves is to call them in for an interview and say, hey, how tall are you? That's a lot better information than saying, well, if you're an average woman, you're this, if you're an average man, you're this, but there's a lot of noise and it could be that you're tall enough. I just don't know, but I'm not going to consider you because you're a woman. That's what we're getting at. And that's why sociologically, we're so against discrimination, because it stymies the gathering of relevant information from individuals. Well, why do we do it? Why is it then that we are so eager, so prone to taking a group of people and saying, I'm going to judge them by their category membership. I don't really want to bother getting information about them as an individual. All right. Here's a statement from an old textbook that I used to teach from. When subjects view different people making statements, they often forget who said what, yet they remember the race of the person who made each statement. This is a powerful statement, validated across decades of social psych research, that if there are three things that you automatically remember about a person, it is their age, it is their gender, and it is their race. Which, by the way, was a real conundrum for people who were taking this from an evolutionary standpoint. Because you can imagine over evolutionary time, there being a good reason to quickly evaluate somebody's age. That would mean whether or not they're likely to be a good mating partner, whether they're still in the reproductive years, whether you should be showing them more or less respect based on your social status or standing, whether they're likely to be strong or weak. I mean, just all number of things. Age is an important thing. Gender, closely correlated with sex, also an extremely important thing to know pretty much right away, because it will have a lot to do in most cultures with how you will end up treating that person. But race? Why would, of all the infinite number of things about a person, whether their earlobes are attached, whether their hair is long, whether their eyes are brown, why would race be something that seems to automatically be categorized by people as an important factor about a person? Evolution didn't seem to have an answer, because here's why. In an evolutionary environment, before we started really getting around the globe a couple thousand years ago, everybody that you encountered over the course of your entire life would, in modern terms, be categorized as the same race. If you grew up in Northern Africa, everybody you meet would be Northern African. If you grew up in Sub-Saharan Africa, everybody you meet would be Sub-Saharan African. If you grew up in Northern Europe, everybody you meet would be Northern European. If you grew up in Asia, everybody you met would be Asian. This idea that within a person's life, it would be important to know which person was of which race didn't make any sense. So this guy, Rob Kurzban, at Santa Barbara, where I just said I went, cooked up with other evolutionary psychologists this idea that the reason it looks like we care so much about race is because human beings are actually, over evolutionary time, extremely interested in who's on what team. We need to keep track of who is in our coalition, who is friendly to us, who is sharing best interests with us, who is interested in our welfare, and reciprocally we're interested in theirs, and who is either a stranger or a member of a hostile group. And the kicker is there are any number of little signs or clues that might give away in-group and out-group membership. That could be ritual adornment, scarring, tattooing, hairstyle, a manner of speech, any number of things that people might have used over the course of evolutionary time to say, I'm a member of this group, and you're a member of that group. And so it appears that over evolutionary time, we've built a mechanism that is kind of wide open as to what the cue might be, but is always looking for something that will tell us who is in our group and who is in another group. And it seems like in the modern environment, that mechanism, which was never designed to pick up race in the first place, has picked up on the tensions in our society between Group A and Group B and said, I figured out how to tell who's a member of Group A and Group B, and it turns out to be these superficial, infrequent, but nevertheless reliable racial characteristics that we call skin color or eye shape or nose shape or whatever it is you want to call it. All right. How do we know? The basics of the study, without going into too much detail, is this. When you cannot remember where a particular message came from, and you've got these two guys to choose from, if that message actually came from a white guy, you are likely at the end of the experiment to say, I can't remember, but you'll choose a white guy to attribute a message to, that message to. So if somebody said, hey, give me the basketball, but you can't remember who said, hey, give me the basketball, but it was a white guy, you'll pick a white guy. In another condition, though, the people who were given statements that you had to try to remember who said them at the very end of the study were not just black or white, but they were given team jerseys so that you had a much, much better cue for this mechanism about who was on what team. Instead of just trying to default to black and white, you had now red shirt and yellow shirt. The tendency to make your attributions based on who said a thing according to who had what race was eliminated. And you defaulted, you went to remembering who said what thing based on what their jersey color was. So here's the thing. If you've got really good, solid information about who's on what coalition or who's on what team, you stop paying attention to who's in what race. But absent that information, this brain mechanism is constantly trying to figure out who's on what team, and it defaults to some cue that's relevant in our society, which is race, and it starts remembering who was a member of what race as a proxy for trying to remember who was on what team. So what we are dealing with is an ancient, ingrained, genetic, inborn, whatever these things mean, evolutionary cognitive mechanism that is desperate to figure out who's on what team and has latched on to some prejudicial explanations in order to satisfy that need. Okay? That inborn human tendency is more pronounced in some people than it is in others. But I would say it is a part of human psychology for everybody. It's just that it has been nurtured or used or activated differently in different people. This leads us to the discussion that the book had on the authoritarian orientation. This mechanism in the brain for being obsessed with who's in group and who's out group is something that can be activated in its extreme by this thing called the authoritarian orientation. The authoritarian cares a lot about who is in group and who is out group, and it cares a lot about the signals and the symbols about who is in group and who is out group. The in group can be identified by their conventional or traditional values. Appropriate dress for men and for women, appropriate forms of address for elders and for peers and for parents, appropriate forms of deference for the people in your society, the things that you do as a value. So an authoritarian person will be very, very concerned with whether or not people are doing the right things, going through the right paces to display their conventional or their traditional values. Another thing that goes along with this orientation, it seems like it's separate, but it correlates quite highly, is the willingness to look to a person who's been recognized as being in authority and follow their orders. That could be the government, but it's probably more people who more directly enforce authority, like the police or a teacher. So a willingness to follow orders under a hierarchical structure is another thing that goes along with authoritarian orientation. And the last, and it turns out to be the most easily manipulated for bad ends, part of the authoritarian orientation is the ability to be threatened by and to target and act against outgroups. Outgroups can be, due to the flexibility of this cognitive mechanism, these outgroups can be just about anything that people are willing to think might be a threat. People from other countries, people with other sexualities, people with other religions, people of other races, people of other political beliefs or orientations. This picture right here, if you don't recognize it, is Joseph McCarthy holding up a list of what was proposed to be the communists who had invaded the US Congress or who had invaded US society. And it was a secret list that he would use in order to meet the threat of the outgroup. Now, here's the big difference. An authoritarian who was looking for the ability to be put in that position of authority so that other people will follow their orders and has manufactured a danger from an outgroup is very different from a person who is taking a leadership position because there is in fact an external threat that requires action to be dealt with. During, let's say, World War II, I hate to go back to what is always the classic example, but I would say that the United States unified under a empowered central government to do things like rationing and meatless Fridays and buying war bonds and keeping your mouth shut about what the weather was, all these things that we were doing for the war effort in response to a legitimate external military threat that attacked us at Pearl Harbor. On the other side, there's Germany, whereby the authoritarian leader was gathering power in order to deal with an imaginary threat that was the Jewish menace that was bringing pestilence and cheating and destruction of our traditional values in society. So these are two sides of the same coin. In order to get people interested in each other's welfare and cooperating and meeting a challenge, sometimes that only comes along when there's an external threat, an outgroup enemy, and everybody realizes how much they have in common. On the other side, a manufactured or overemphasized external enemy can serve nothing more than to create the willingness to take orders from someone who sets themselves up as the authoritarian leader. So it is both a dark side and a light side of social psychology that this seems to be the way the human mind works. And it's really hard to figure out exactly what to do about it. When these things are really strong, when these outgroup and in-group operations are really operating at a full clip, there are things that happen you can observe in the data. There's this thing called outgroup homogeneity. Outgroup homogeneity is the idea that if somebody is identified as a member of an outgroup, you tend to homogenize them, which is you tend to think that they all look alike, act alike, think alike. If somebody's an outgroup, then there's no use in looking at them as individuals. You know everything you need to know, they're all the same. That is true when people try to identify individuals in another race that is not theirs and identify their individual pictures. They are often less able to tell one individual apart from another individual if they're of a different race than they are able to tell individuals of their own race apart from each other. The flip side of that is the own race bias. Not only is everybody else who's in that group the same as each other, but we in our own race are individuals. I can I can tell the difference between me and another person of my race. I might be a good person. That other person who's in my race is a bad person, but that doesn't have anything to do with our race. It's just me and him. We're different. There's also this thing called in-group bias. In-group bias is the idea that you will tend to see your in-group as better than other groups. Okay, so everybody else in another group is the same, outgroup homogeneity. I can tell all the difference between the rich diversity of people in my group, own race bias, and my group happens to be better than your group, in-group bias, all right? Other factors about cognitive functions which might make this prejudice discrimination thing worse. There's a thing called cognitive closure, whereby, and look, I don't want to say that the people who engage in a higher degree of cognitive closure are lazy people, because there is a lot about human cognition that is based on the idea that our brain tries to work as little as possible. Our brains take shortcuts everywhere. And a lot of what it means to be a good scientist is to try to identify and avoid your brain taking those shortcuts. But one of the shortcuts that brains take is cognitive closure, where somebody wants to believe that they have enough information, they want to make their judgment and stick with it so they don't have to think about it anymore. And so if you gather a little bit of information, a stereotype or a prejudice about a group, you're like, good, I know everything I need to know about people from Alabama. Done. That's cognitive closure. And it's going to be very hard to make that person change their mind when they meet a person from Alabama because they've already made their decisions. Another thing that is a product of this outgroup homogeneity, this in-group bias, and their own race bias is the idea that it really helps illusory correlations take off and get people convinced that their stereotypes are in fact based in reality. So here's the thing. If you see somebody out there in the world doing something and they are an outgroup member, you will say, that's the kind of thing that outgroup members do. And if it fits the stereotype, it's proof that your stereotype is right. But if somebody's doing something that you don't like, but they're a member of your group, you say that individual, that person is a jerk. It's not like white people do that. It's like white people don't do that. That guy does that because they are a bad person. So one of the more pernicious stereotypes that are out there is that for some reason, I'm not sure where this came from, Asian drivers are bad. They're not good at driving. I have no idea whether there is any statistical regularity or evidence to this at all. It doesn't matter. It's a stereotype for the purposes of demonstration. But if you see one person get in an accident or stop short and you look at the driver and you see that they're Asian, you're like, yep. But you could see 50 people of your own race do the exact same thing and say, man, those are all bad drivers, but it doesn't have anything to do with the group that they're in. So that's a cognitive shortcut, all too common. We all engage in it. That helps this illusory correlation that you only remember the stuff that fits your stereotype. And so you start to think that it happens all the time and it's a solid correlation and that it's the truth. Can we get rid of prejudice? It's not that easy. Prejudice is something that happens relatively quickly. It's relatively stable. It's hard to get rid of. But when they were integrating schools after the mandatory desegregation orders of the Supreme Court, teachers figured out that there were a couple of things that they could do that actually helped to ease the tension between the students who used to be in separate schools but were now in racially integrated schools. They called it the jigsaw method. But what they did was they ended up taking groups of kids, mixing them by race, and then giving them all a task that they had to perform together in order to achieve a good outcome. So every piece of the task was taken over by a different group member, and they put them all together at the end like a jigsaw puzzle in order to kind of help reprogram their cognitive biases in a way that was hopefully helpful. This had to be under certain circumstances, though. The kids all had to be similar in status. If you are someone who is trying to change an attitude of white students who are seeing new Black students come into their school, it doesn't work if the Black students are seen not only as a racial minority, but also different in ways that let people hang on to their prejudices about that person. If they are lower income, or if they're different social rank or status or location, that doesn't really seem to work. The task that they all have to do together has to be interdependent. They have to depend on each other for success. It can't be just a kind of faceless group of people. They have to work and have conversations one-on-one so that people are looking each other in the eye, learning names and knowing individuals. And the last and most important thing is the people who were in those jigsaw experiences could not end up seeing the people they worked with as the exception to the rule. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. If you have a prejudice against a group of people, but you end up meeting one member of that group and getting along and valuing them and liking them, you could still maintain your prejudice against that group if you come to believe that that person was an exception, that they're exceptional. You hear people say this all the time, and they say, oh, I don't have anything against so-and-so. Some of my best friends are. Well, that's a person who is really actually holding on to a prejudice, but they are making exceptions for the people who are close to them. That won't work. You have to be able to see the people that you're working with and learning about as typical members of a group full of people that are also individual people. So I pulled this quote from this meme from the internet today. which really seemed to hit the nail on the head. Crystal, I love you. You're not like other Black people. That is a person who might be creating a warm relationship with an individual, but nevertheless still has a distinct stereotype discrimination or stereotype prejudice and probably discrimination problem because they refuse to see somebody they get along with as a typical member of an out group. That's what I had for today. Okay. I hope that that it went down well. We've got 2 more lectures after this to do in the social psych chapter. That'll be on Wednesday and on Friday. I will give you an email today about what's going on this week to make sure that you don't fall behind. And that's about it. All right. You hear from me soon. See you later.